Okay, take a look around you right now. At your desk, maybe your phone, maybe just look out the window. What's something you can see or touch that came from a forest? It could be, the paper your notes are on, the wooden desk you might be sitting at, maybe a door frame.
Or maybe the spices in your kitchen, coffee this morning.
Yeah, exactly. Or even the oil in your chocolate bar.
Yeah.
That can come from cell seeds, right? From a forest.
Absolutely. And think about bamboo, maybe for fences or baskets, or dried gourds people used as water bottles.
Wow, okay.
Leaves stitched together for plates, creepers for ropes, even bark for grating vegetables or herbs for medicine. Natural forests, they just provide this incredible, vast diversity of resources.
The source material mentions finding as many as 500 different plant species in just one patch of forest, places like the Amazon or India's Western Ghats.
It's staggering, this really intricate web of life that supports so much.
And yet this amazing diversity, it's disappearing fast. Now, look, deforestation isn't totally new. People have cleared forests for farming for, centuries. But what our source material really points out is how, under colonial rule, this process became something else entirely. Much more systematic, widespread, and driven by completely different demands.
Exactly. When we think about, the modern world, emerging factories, cities, global trade, we often miss this huge piece.
Yeah.
So this deep dive, we're going to use the source material to really unpack how that whole process fundamentally changed the lives, the economies of people who lived in and depended entirely on forests.
And we're focusing particularly on India and Indonesia during that colonial period.
Right.
And this isn't just like dusty history. Understanding these massive shifts, how forests were viewed, who got control, who lost out, it's absolutely crucial for understanding the world today.
Yeah, environmental challenges, land conflicts, it's all connected back. These communities, they aren't just relics. Their histories are really relevant right now.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start by looking at life in the forest, before colonialism really started reshaping things so heavily.
Right. Before colonial powers really asserted control, you had all these diverse communities living in and using forests in incredibly varied ways. It wasn't just about, getting wood for building.
No, not at all. It was about, everything. The source talks about using roots, leaves, fruits, tubers for food, for medicine, wood for tools like plows. Bamboo wasn't just fences, it was baskets, even umbrellas.
Right. And a dried gourd becomes your water bottle. Leaves stitched together, boom, disposable plates for a feast.
Simple but effective.
Totally. Creepers for ropes, bark for grating veggies, and that oil for cooking in lamps, often pressed from the mahua fruit. It was this complete system woven right into what the forest offered.
What's really fascinating is how integrated their lives, their management practices were with the forest itself.
Yeah.
The source gives that example from Bastar in central India. People there believed the earth gave them the land. They had this responsibility to look after it, respect the spirits, like river, forest, mountain spirits.
And they had clear village boundaries, right? They managed resources within those boundaries.
Exactly. And if someone needed wood from another village's forest, they'd pay a small fee. The source mentions names like Devsari Dand, manned these traditional payments.
Some villages even had watchmen, paid in grain, specifically to protect their forests. It was really a community-based management system.
But that local community system, it just wasn't built for the demands of these growing global empires, was it?
No, not at all. And that's where things take this really dramatic turn. Colonial rule brought this rapid, extensive deforestation, driven not by local needs, but by, global imperial demands.
Yeah, like shipbuilding. That was a big early one.
Huge. By the early 19th century, England's oak forests were disappearing fast. Big problem for the Royal Navy. No timber, no ships, no empire, basically.
Right.
So they sent search parties to India in the 1820s, and within a decade, boom, trees being felled on a massive scale, huge amounts of timber exported back to England.
And that demand, it wasn't just ships for long, was it? It quickly shifted to feed another massive project, the railways.
Yes. Spreading across India from the 1850s, railways were absolutely essential for colonial trade, moving goods out, moving troops in.
And they needed wood. Locomotives needed fuel.
Yep, but the real killer was the demand for sleepers. Those wooden planks that hold the tracks?
Uh-huh.
Each mile of track needed somewhere between, 1,760 and 2,000 sleepers.
Wow, just think about the scale.
It's immense. The network grew so fast, by 1890, maybe 25,500 kilometers of track in India. By 1946, over 765,000 kilometers.
That's just mind-boggling numbers of trees for the sleepers alone.
Totally. The source gives a specific example. 1850s Madras presidency alone, 35,000 trees cut annually, just for sleepers.
And the government gave contracts to individuals.
Right, and these contractors often just cut trees indiscriminately. Whole forests just flattened.
Source B has even more stark numbers. The Indus Valley Railway, nearly 300 miles long, needed 600,000 sleepers, over 2 million cubic feet of timber, plus massive amounts of fuel every year.
And the Northern State Railway needed 2.2 million sleepers just for construction. That kind of demand, it just completely transforms the landscape. Unprecedented rate of clearing.
Okay, so beyond timber for ships and railways, agriculture was another huge driver.
Definitely. Peasants had always cleared forests as populations grew, sure, but the colonial period just accelerated it massively.
Why? What was the driver there?
Well, think about 19th century Europe. Growing cities needed food, industries needed raw materials, so there was this huge demand for commercial crops. Jute, sugar, wheat, cotton.
And the colonial state looked at forests very differently than the locals did.
Completely. They saw large forests as like unproductive wilderness, something that needed to be improved.
Improved meaning cleared for agriculture.
Exactly. Cleared so the land could produce commercial crops and, crucially, generate revenue for the state.
The numbers show it between 1880 and 1920. Cultivated area in India went up by 6.7 million hectares. That's massive.
And this wasn't just happening in India. The source mentions this global rhetoric used to justify taking over land. Source A quotes an American writer in Honduras basically saying, uncultivated land should go to the great power willing to use it.
Right, not the local owner who fails to understand its value. That mindset.
It was everywhere. It led to things like the United Fruit Company in Central America, the Banana Republics, or in Australia, the whole terra nullius's empty land idea, totally ignoring Aboriginal land use.
So this idea of improving land by forcing colonial-style agriculture was a global thing.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, you had the plantations.
Tea, coffee, rubber.
Yep. Huge areas of diverse natural forests just cleared, wiped out, and replaced with these single crop plantations. Again, mainly to meet European demand.
And the colonial government helped this along.
Oh, yeah. They took over forest lands and basically handed them over cheaply to European planters, who then fenced them off and cleared them for their cash crops.
So all this rapid clearing. Eventually, the British themselves started to worry.
They did, but importantly, not really, because they valued the forest ecosystem or the people living there.
No, it was about their timber supply.
Exactly. They feared that local use and this unregulated trade would destroy the forests they needed for valuable timber in the future. They needed control.
Okay, so that's when they brought in the expert, Dietrich Brandis.
That's the guy. A German expert, appointed first Inspector General of Forests in India in 1864.
And he pushed for a more formal system.
Right. A system to manage forests for timber production. Laws, rules for forest use, restricting felling and grazing, all to preserve timber.
And this led to actual institutions being set up.
Yep. The Indian Forest Service in 1864, the first Indian Forest Act in 1865, later amended, made stricter, and the Imperial Forest Research Institute in Dehradun in 1906.
And this system got called scientific forestry.
It did, but the source rightly points out many people, especially ecologists today, really question how scientific it was in terms of, actual ecology.
So what did it look like in practice?
Often it meant clearing the diverse natural forest and planting just one type of tree in straight rows.
Right.
Basically, creating plantations optimized for timber.
Like a farm for trees.
Pretty much. Forest officials surveyed everything, planned cutting cycles, replanting schedules, all geared towards timber harvest.
And the Forest Act, the 1878 one, formalized this control.
Yeah, it divided forests into categories. Reserved forests, where villagers basically couldn't take anything, not even firewood.
Wow.
And then protected or village forests, where they had some limited access, maybe for house building or fuel, but still under really strict rules.
And this created a fundamental clash, didn't it? Between what the Forest Department wanted and what villagers actually needed.
Huge clash. Officials wanted those tall, straight hardwoods, teak, saw perfect for ships, railways.
But villagers needed a mix.
Exactly. They needed fuel, fodder for their animals, leaves, fruits, roots, everything we talked about earlier. They needed the diversity.
So these new laws, this new system, It must have caused immense hardship for ordinary villagers.
Severe hardship. Everyday things they'd always done, cutting wood for their homes, grazing cattle, collecting food and medicine from the forest, hunting, fishing suddenly, all illegal.
So people were forced to, what, steal from their own forests?
Pretty much. Risk getting caught, face fines, harassment, bribery from forest guards, police. Women collecting fuel wood were especially vulnerable.
And what about specific traditional practices, like shifting cultivation?
Yes. That was hit hard. Known by so many names, leading milpa, jurchem.
How did that work again?
Basically, you cut and burn a section of forest, plant seeds in the ashes. The ash provides nutrients. Harvest, then leave that plot fallow for many years, maybe 12, 18 years, sometimes longer. Let the forest grow back.
And they usually grew mixed crops.
Yeah, not monoculture. It's a rotational system. Works with the forest cycle.
But the European foresters hated it.
Absolutely hated it. They felt it stopped their valuable timber trees from growing. Plus, the burning. They saw it as a fire risk to their timber reserves.
And it was hard to control, hard to tax.
Exactly. So the government just banned it in many areas.
Yeah.
Forcibly displaced communities. Huge disruption. Some people were forced into other jobs. Others resisted. Big conflicts.
Hunting, too. That changed completely.
Drastically. Customary hunting just for survival was vital for many communities. The new laws made it poaching punishable.
But at the same time,
ironically, big game hunting became the celebrated colonial sport.
that seems contradictory.
Well, the British view, according to the source, was that large animals represented a wild, savage society. Killing them was part of civilizing India.
Seriously.
Yeah. They even offered rewards for killing tigers, wolves, leopards. The numbers are insane. Between 1875 and 1925, over 80,000 tigers, 150,000 leopards, 200,000 wolves killed for rewards.
Good grief. And individuals boasted about it.
Oh, yeah. The source mentions the Maharaja of Sarguja shooting over 1,000 tigers and 2,000 leopards. A British administrator, George Ewell, killed 400 tigers himself.
It's staggering. Only later did the conservation idea start to emerge.
Much later, yeah. When species were already facing extinction, then conservationists stepped in. Initially, some forests were even reserved for British hunting.
Okay, so livelihoods are being destroyed, practices banned. What about trade and jobs?
Also transformed. Trade in forest products existed, but the government heavily regulated it, often gave monopoly rights to big European firms.
Squeezing out local traders?
Exactly. And pastoralist communities, nomadic groups who relied on moving through forests, they were hit hard. Many lost their livelihoods. Some were even labeled criminal tribes by the state.
Criminal tribes? What did that mean?
It meant they were forced into supervised labor. Factories, mines, plantations.
Like the tea plantations in Assam.
Yeah, the source mentions people recruited from forest communities sent to Assam. Terrible wages, awful conditions, often couldn't even get back home. Trapped.
And Source D gives that really horrific example from the Amazon. Rubber extraction.
Deeply disturbing. Putumayo region. Forced labor of local indigenous communities for rubber. The source describes torture, disease, people fleeing, a population crash of maybe 30,000 people in just over a decade.
Because of the brutality linked to rubber quotas.
Yes, including a manager massacring workers who didn't meet their targets. It's a stark reminder of the human cost tied directly to global demand and colonial control.
So, faced with all this losing land, livelihoods banned, this kind of brutality, it's no surprise people resisted.
Not at all. The source mentions famous leaders in India, Sidhu and Kanu, Birsa Munda, Alluri Sitarama Raju people still remembered for leading movements against these forest laws and other colonial policies.
And the Bastar Rebellion in 1910 is a key example we can look at.
Definitely. Bastar, southern part of modern Chhattisgarh, home to various communities, Gons, Durwas, Batras, Halbas, different languages but shared beliefs about the forest.
That deep connection we mentioned earlier, land given by earth, respect for spirits managing their own areas.
Right. And their fears really spiked when the colonial government proposed reserving 2/3 of their forest in 1905, banning shifting cultivation, hunting, collecting produce.
And these forest villages were created.
Yeah, some were allowed to stay in reserved areas, but only if they worked for free for the forest department. Cutting trees, fighting fires, others were just kicked out. No notice, no compensation.
And this came on top of other grievances. High rents, demands for free labor, famines.
Exactly. Those famines in 1899 and 1907 were devastating. The reservation plan was really the final straw.
So how did the rebellion actually start? How did they organize?
People started talking in village councils, at markets, during festivals where leaders met. The Durwas, whose lands were hit first by the reservation, kind of took the lead.
Was there one main leader?
No single undisputed leader for the whole thing, but Gunda Dur from Nethanar village was definitely a key figure in organizing it.
And they used symbolic messages to communicate.
Yeah, in 1910, messages started circulating. Not written notes, but things like a mango bough, a lump of earth, chilies, arrows. Each village that got the message contributed something to the cause.
What did the rebellion actually involve? What did they do?
They targeted symbols of the colonial state and its allies, looted bazaars, burned houses of officials and traders seen as oppressive, attacked schools, police stations. They even redistributed grain they found.
Source E gives specific accounts, right? Leaders like Bandia, Mashi, organizing people, burning posts, capturing police.
Yeah, blocking roads too, trying to slow down the British troops.
And Source F has those accounts from elders.
Incredibly valuable. Stories passed down. They talk about the battles, the British tactics, whipping people, tying them to horses, but also how villagers used their knowledge of the forest to escape and hide. Gunda Dur himself was never captured.
The British sent troops, obviously.
Of course. They suppressed it brutally, surrounded camps, fired on rebels, marched through villages, punishing people. Took about 3 months to regain control. Many villagers fled into the jungle.
But the rebels achieved something.
A major victory, actually. The government had to back down, reservation work was suspended, and when it restarted, the area to be reserved was cut roughly in half.
That's significant. And these conflicts didn't just end with independence.
No, absolutely not. The source mentions conflict continuing, like a World Bank project in the 1970s in Bastar to replace sal forest with pine for paper stopped only after big protests. That tension between industrial needs and local forests persists.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. The source also draws parallels with Java under the Dutch.
Right. Similar story, different colonial power. Java, now famous for rice, used to be heavily forested, especially with teak.
And the Dutch needed timber too.
Just like the British. Ships, railways. Java had communities skilled in forest work, like the Kalang.
The Kalangs? They were expert forest cutters.
Highly skilled. So valuable that when the Mataram Kingdom split in 1755, the source says 6,000 Kalang families were literally divided equally between the two new kingdoms. Their skills were that crucial.
Wow. And they resisted the Dutch.
They did. When the Dutch tried to control the forests, the Kalangs attacked a Dutch fort in 1770. It was suppressed, but it shows the resistance was there early on.
And later, the Dutch imposed similar forest laws as the British in India.
Very similar. 19th century laws restricting access, limiting wood cutting, harsh punishments for breaking rules like grazing cattle or using forest roads without permits.
Again, driven by timber needs. Source G mentions Java's inexhaustible potential.
Yeah, that Dutch official saw huge potential if managed efficiently. In 1882 alone, they exported 280,000 sleepers from Java. Huge numbers.
How did they get the labor for all this cutting and transport?
They used a system called Blandendiensten. Initially, they forced villages to provide free labor and buffaloes in return for rent exemptions.
Forced labor, essentially.
Pretty much. Later, they switched to paying low wages, but also restricted villagers' rights to cultivate forest land. Still exploitative.
And this led to resistance, too, like Samin's challenge.
Yes, Saroniko Saman, around 1890, he lived in a teak forest village and started questioning the whole idea of state ownership.
On what grounds?
Very fundamental grounds. He argued the state didn't create the wind, water, earth, or wood. They're natural elements, so how can the state own them?
That's a powerful argument. Did it catch on?
It really did. Sparked a movement. By 1907, maybe 3,000 families were following his ideas, protesting through non-compliance.
How do they protest?
Refused to pay taxes or fines, refused forest labor, and famously, when the Dutch came to survey their land, they'd just lie down on it, physically blocking the process, a kind of passive resistance.
Interesting. Now, what about the impact of the world wars?
Huge impact. Changed everything again. In India, those careful working plans were often just thrown out. The Forest Department cut trees freely to meet British war needs.
Source H shows timber piled up for war shipment, right?
Exactly. And in Java, during WWII, before the Japanese invaded, the Dutch used a scorched earth policy. Destroyed sawmills, burned massive piles of valuable teak logs so the Japanese couldn't get them.
And the Japanese.
They exploited the forests recklessly themselves, forced villagers into harsh labor cutting trees.
But this chaos also created an opportunity for villagers.
It did. With authority breaking down, many villagers expanded their own cultivation into forest areas just to grow food.
So after the war, the Indonesian Forest Service had trouble getting that land back.
Big challenge. Highlights that ongoing conflict. People's need for farmland versus state control over forests.
Okay, so this history is complex, often brutal. But the source does suggest some shifts more recently, since the 1980s.
Yeah, there's been a slow recognition in parts of Asia and Africa anyway, that the old scientific forestry model, the one that excluded local people, caused a lot of conflict, and maybe wasn't even the best way to protect forests.
So the thinking is shifting, towards conservation maybe.
Shifting slowly from just timber collection towards conservation, and crucially understanding that you need to involve local communities. They live there, they have the knowledge.
And we see examples of this working.
We do. In India, from Mizoram down to Kerala, you find dense forests that survived because villages protected them for generations, often as sacred groves, sarnas, Devarkudu, Kan, Rai.
Some villages even patrol their own forests now.
Yeah, organizing their own patrols, taking turns guarding. So communities, sometimes working with environmentalists, are exploring new ways, learning from this history.
It feels like maybe a return in some ways to valuing local knowledge.
Perhaps, recognizing that forests aren't just timber factories or empty land, but complex ecosystems tied to people's lives and cultures.
So, wrapping this up, where does this deep dive leave us? We've traced this huge transformation. Forests went from being these diverse resources, managed locally, often with deep cultural ties,
to becoming strategic assets for empires, leading to massive deforestation, imposed management systems, real hardship, and inevitably resistance.
We saw how demands from faraway ships, railways, crops, plantations reshaped landscapes and lives across continents, often brutally.
Yeah, dismissing or crushing existing ways of life and knowledge systems in the process.
But understanding this history, it really helps us appreciate that deep connection between people and nature that was disrupted, the sheer impact of these big economic and political forces.
And the resilience of communities who fought back, who tried to protect their world.
So it leaves us with a question to think about, doesn't it?
Definitely. The source mentioned that colonial idea, uncultivated land had to be taken over and improved.
Right. How does that historical idea about land use, about improvement, how does it still shape conflicts today over resources, over community rights?
And maybe even more fundamentally, when we look at a forest, what does value really mean? Is it just the timber, the commodities you can sell?
Or is there something deeper? Ecological, cultural, livelihood value.
Yeah.
The value recognized by people who lived with forests for generations. And maybe the value we need to rediscover today.